makes me want to throw out my whole speech and just talk about the feelings they've evoked. It's very difficult, right? So there's 65 countries represented here. There's 200, so to speak, in the world. 30,000 cultural groups, First Nations, indigenous peoples. And up until now, or recently, the biggest responsibility for each was to make a good enough life among themselves, right? Among ourselves. And now that whole era is ending and a whole new age is beginning. We're so interconnected. We are functioning as a whole, as a system, and so we have an additional responsibility. Everybody is still responsible for making a good enough life among their own people. But now we're also responsible for thinking things through, feeling our way into a better existence together as a whole, as a system, right? So in the talk about dialogue as a way of being together, I think is an invitation into thinking about how do we go about this whole, operating as a whole. So I wanted to use some of the ecological issues as ways of reflecting on that, of how, what we're called upon to be different together about. So I'm going to try to sprint. I apologize. Climate change. If the sea level rises, it affects all coastal places, all villages and cities universally. So as a whole, we're called upon to respond to it. At the same time, food production will get worse in some places and better in others. So there's local effects. So when we think about ecology, both responsibilities are called into play. Local, among ourselves, and global, responding all together. It is said that the amount of food we have now is based on overdrawing the freshwater supplies on the planet, so it's not sustainable. And when oil disappears, the petroleum-based fertilizer goes, the food bubble will collapse, and there'll be a huge problem. So a different way of thinking about things than power is, what is my society, your society, going to do about food? What are you going to do about fresh water? That's the issue we talk about in psychology as self-care. You think about your real life. You take care with your real life. You take care with your home. Also, I think about, I was just in England, what are they going to do about food in the future? Right? They don't grow enough of their own. What about Japan? What about Saudi Arabia? So I think a thing is we care about each other. That's part of the difference that I hope will exist in this future age. We think about a caring attitude about how other societies are doing. We would want other societies to flourish, right? That's very different. 90% of the large fish in the oceans are already gone. They have already disappeared, right? So clearly there's overfishing. And so on the one hand, that is not solvable except by a global response. And on the other hand, that means the loss of jobs for lots of people in lots of places. So what it suggests is we need a sensitivity to each other, to the people who are losing the jobs. Some people, I think, would be glad to get off the boats and the industrial fishing, but a lot of people who do that love the sea, right? What happens to their dignity, the meaning of their lives, the traditional life they have? So on the one hand, we need to be globally active and assertive together, and on the other hand, we have to be, there's a responsibility to all the people who will be affected on that level. We need to listen sensitively to each other as change proceeds. So over-demand is partly because of this industrial way of life. So there's a lot of talk about the hegemonic power, right? The unipolar power, that's my country, right? So in my country, we are compulsively addicted to a process that starts with industrialization, then marketing, then buying the stuff, and then getting rid of it into landfills as quickly as possible to make room for buying more stuff. And it's using up, so oil is going to run out. As was said yesterday, the internal combustion engines and the jet fuel engines won't run anymore. The industrial way of life may kind of collapse. So you'd think we would want to be prudent and pace out the consumption of oil. We're racing to hit the wall. You know, with plastic bags and plastic this and that, we're going as fast as we can to, it sounds like, hit bottom. As they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, you hit bottom and then you begin to think about change. We ask, you know, for taking better care with our society, and we can't stop ourselves. And I say, why not? On the one hand, there's an excitement in figuring out new ways to take raw materials and put them through some kind of manufacturing process and make something that never existed before. There's an excitement, I guess, in going to malls and finding new shiny things that never existed before. But there's also the normality of life. This is how we in the U.S., we have our jobs, we maintain our homes. This is the fabric of life. This is what we know how to do. We don't know how to do anything else. And so when we're asked to change this, it's like life can unravel completely. It's an invitation into the unknown, into chaos. It's very frightening. And it raises the question, so what is the alternative? What is the new way of making life together that will be so rewarding to us as humans that we would look back on this industrial stuff and say, we're so much better off now that we're not doing that addiction to consumption stuff. A society that cares for itself, for its own future, must pursue this central question put to us really by Bhutan. What actually grows national happiness, right? So it occurred to me, a characteristic of all of us being in on life together globally is not only that we care about how other societies are doing as well as our own, but that we have this dialogue, and there are some specific questions that I would suggest would be very helpful to focus dialogue on. One is, how are you in your society? How are you going about physical survival? How are you taking care of your future, right? A second question, in your long history, what is it that you have learned about what makes for a well-loved life? What have you learned about how to make happiness together? Because we've learned some things in my country, which is very young, but I'm sure there are many things we haven't learned that you have learned, and perhaps many things that you have learned that others have learned other things. So together we can learn from each other. How do you go about making a life that at the end of life you look back and you smile because you love how you have lived? How do we make that kind of existence together? 10? Okay. All right. So, this is so crucial now because we have traumatized each other globally. That's what we've been doing for so long. What have you learned in your society about how people go from an existence marked by need to control, striving for power, anger, fear, all that stuff, to an existence where people are trustworthy and therefore trust each other, where they're happy together, where it's a joy to be alive, where you feel grateful to exist in that kind of historical times? What have you learned about how to make that journey? We need to listen to each other about that because we don't know, and yet that is the journey we face, right? And I want to wrap up by saying some things about my hegemonic country. You know, this business of going from unipolar to multipolar, I would suggest thinking a little differently, going from unipolar to no polar. Because if you think multipolar means what, 7, 9 poles, something like that, and most of the 65 of us here are not going to be among them, right? So no poles. Dialogue is no poles. Dialogue is anybody can have wisdom. We need to listen to everybody because no matter how little land you have, you may have the insight the rest of us need to make a better future. So why should America buy into this? The message you can have to America, listen, it's good to be equal. So you feel responsible every day for controlling everything on the planet. You know how stressful that is? It would be a great relief to let it go. Let it go, America. Tell us that. You think, America, we are scared. Reassure us. It's going to be okay. It would be good to have friends that could help us figure out some of our own problems. So don't be afraid. I think I would say to the world, don't be afraid to come in and tell us to stop being so strong and stop being on top of it. It will be okay. It will be better. So, thank you. I'm sorry to be so abrupt, but thank you.